Are comic creators putting less effort into comics? And specifically, I'm talking on the art side here. It's hard to quantify on the writing side, but let's go into the art side and pull this thing out. Hey, this is Perch. I'm thinking "pull this thing out" is not a great tagline for a video. Maybe that's. See, now I'm gonna fall into this Copa Kid thing on YouTube. Shouldn't have said that. Anyway, I this comment comes up a lot when people are critiquing reviewing comics, and basically it's that the art quality has sunk. And I've done videos on this to some extent in the past. I try and look at this from a factual or an analytical kind of side, because the problem is, if you're going to talk about art quality, you're into subjective town. Different people are going to like different things. One man's Jim Lee is another man's Frank Frazetta. I mean, those are two very different people. And while I do think that there is a subjective argument you can make toward skill, and I've done videos on this too. If you draw Superman and his head is the size of his leg, then you can say, well, this artist does not have a good grasp on anatomy, and there's just fundamental flaws in how this art's being produced. And I think that's a true statement. I think you can make those kind of subjective calls. I think some artists are able to make very distinctive, unique styles work for them, and that's kind of a whole different thing. That's a whole different beast. But it is also true that the comic companies are, in some cases, let's put it this way. I'd want to try and say this very fairly, because I think that these statements are thrown out and they're not well thought through. So my statement is simply, I think that comic companies are paying less and trying a different style or different production approach for art. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, for example, comic companies are now more and more utilizing the approach of having the penciler and inker be the same. This is a cost-cutting measure. It does save them money. I'm sure there are some artists who like it because they maybe make a little bit more per page than they used to. But this is the resulting work is that you've got one pair of hands working on something instead of two. And generally speaking, you're going to get a more rushed result, especially if you're doing a monthly comic and trying to churn that out. Some artists can handle this just fine. Some artists look scratchy and weak with it. I think Sarah Pichelli, if you look at when she had an inker, when she does not have an inker, or when she's doing it herself, there's a downgrade of quality that comes out. Just I think, well, again, quality is subjective, but I think you can see a difference. Well, let's go with that. You can see a difference between somebody who has a separate inker and somebody who does it themselves. You may or may not like that difference. That's your business. But then comes the next piece, which is you're seeing more and more of the name artists, the known artists, being relegated to covers or events or special projects, and you see the artists inside of many just regular monthly comics being people you've never heard of before. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean the quality is going to be worse, but it does mean that something is happening, which is the known artists charge more for a comic. Therefore, they are hiring unknown artists, which you can make a educated guess that they are being paid less. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but it's probably fair to assume that. And so there is a cost-cutting kind of behavior that's taking place, both with lesser known artists and also the artists combining penciling and inking in one. Okay, the combination of two saves the company money, but probably there's a resulting drop in quality. Now, at this point, it's worth mentioning that that everybody was an unknown artist at one point. Jim Lee did one of the backup stories for Solo Avengers, drawing Mockingbird. Nobody knew, Jim Lee was not a household name at that point, and his work was nowhere close to the level of where it is today. It was still, solid, good work, but you could see how his skill evolved. And I guess everybody comes from somewhere. So some of these unknown artists today are going to be known artists 20 years from now. Some won't. There's one other factor I think that's worth mentioning, and that's the tracing approach or the using photo reference approach. We've seen more and more of that. Why? Well, because as we've gone more to digital, it's now easier to photo reference or trace, and we've seen some big name artists, one in particular, get relatively popular for doing lots of tracing, particularly of female porn actresses. And that is, I'm looking at you, Mr. Land. That is kind of opened the door to having it be accepted for more of this behavior, more of this style of art. And for artists, I'm sure in some cases this is again another boon. Tracing is faster by and large, and you get maybe a quicker results. You're able to maximize your time drawing the page, the money you're going to receive. All good stuff. But all of these factors, I think, equate to there's a change in art, and I think you could make a good, reasonable argument that the quality has, quote unquote, decreased. I get into this argument with, was it Let's Talk Comic Book Art, or I don't know, some Twitter account. I forget. I think Comic Book Art is in there somewhere. Maybe it's a Let's Talk account. I'm not sure. But it's that argument of, well, you can't really ever say what's good art and what's bad art because everything is everybody has a different view. True, but it's not, like I said, there are some things, some factors that have taken place that at least suggest that some art is not as good as other art, or at least the time being spent is not as good. What does all this mean? Again, I think you wander into dangerous territory when you're saying big blanket statements like Marvel art is trash now. Okay, well, first of all, there's a lot of different books produced. Are we saying that all of it? Are we saying that most of it? Are we saying that the non-big books are trash, but the big ones are good still? Are we saying that the good artists have gotten worse? Are we saying all the above? I mean, again, you can say that for your own personal opinion all day long, but I think it's also useful to be able to go into the details of why you think the way you do. Why do you think that the art isn't as good? What factors have made it not as good? I think you have a better conversation, frankly, when you do. I think if you're able to go into a room and say, or onto an argument and say, I think Marvel's art has gotten worse over decades, specifically the fact that, they don't have a distinct inker, the coloring is all digital now and it creates a washed out view of the page. The big name artists are being forced to do more work, so you're seeing their work looks more rushed. I think these are all things where you have some data points to support your argument. And I do think it's also interesting to at least look at, hey, there's different, over the decades, there's always been different, for lack of a better word, farming strategies for where these companies are going to get their talent from. And right now there's a definite farming strategy to pick up people from South America and kind of cultivate art talent from that region. Nothing wrong with that. People come from wherever. That's all cool. But there is you just got to dig a little bit. Why are the companies doing this? What is going on? Are they trying to save money? Is it that the South American art style, I don't think there is such a thing, but is there an art style there that's just popular right now, sort of how in the 90s everybody had pockets and big guns? These are just interesting questions to ask, and I think it helps us understand comics a little bit better when we can look at the full scope of what's going on with art and how it changes over time, and if we think that things are getting worse. One last, I think, piece in all this, I think it's worth throwing in, is there's an effect that happens with every single person, and whether you realize it or you don't, it's still happening to you. And that is when you first come into comics, when you first start reading comics, your first comic that you pick up, that first year of material you're reading sets a bit of a template in your brain of what comics are. And so whether it's conscious or subconscious, you do start to view what is good or what is a comic through the lens of how you were introduced into comics. And so a lot of people came into comics during the 90s boom and rush. And today, of course, the art style and the writing style and the comics themselves are much different than they were in the 90s. That's true. Nothing wrong with that. It's just times change. And so for some, the comic being junk today is more a statement of the comics are not like it when I was introduced to comics. And I think that's not anything anybody should be ashamed of. That's why nostalgia exists. That's why J.J. Abrams makes the movies he makes. We have things that we love in our life. Our first kiss, the first plane ride we were on, the first country we visited, the first haircut we got, whatever. Who knows? All the different things. You remember those in your life, and those give you happy, fond memories. And there's nothing wrong with that. So I think when I see arguments made of like the comics were better when I started reading comics, and then some people trash like, oh, you just need to accept the new style. No, you don't actually. You're welcome to just like what you like, and if you came to the party liking '90s style comic art, don't be ashamed, and don't let anybody tell you you're doing it wrong. You're doing it just fine. That's what. That's why you came to comics. You saying I would like more comics to be like when I fell in love with comics is kind of that that makes sense. That would be like saying I wish more. I like steak, and I went to a steak restaurant and had the perfect medium rare steak, and medium well steak, disgusting, medium rare steak, and and so therefore I want my steaks medium rare. That's your preference, and you're entitled to it. Don't ever let somebody tell you you're wrong for that. Anyway, what do you think? Quantifiable data on art. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? What do you think of these metrics? Do you have your own? I'm sure you do. Let me know in the comments below. Like, subscribe, follow me on Twitter at Comic Perch. Thanks for listening.